Today we're going to paint our Klee landscapes with watercolor paint. Now, in order to paint our landscapes, we're going to use a special technique called wet on wet. That means that we're going to be putting wet watercolor paint onto wet paper. So we have to get our paper wet before we start painting. Wet on wet is a technique that lets your colors be very, very blendy. So we're going to really make our paper wet so that our colors can mix together well. Now I am going to choose a hill that I want to paint first. I think I'm going to start with this hill. So I'm just going to dip my soft watercolor brush into some clean water, and I'm going to brush some water onto this hill only. Make sure you do not cross the black line. I also want to make sure that I don't have a puddle of water on my paper. One dip into the water bucket is probably enough to get your whole paper, the whole hill, wet. So I'm just spreading it out over the whole entire hill. So I don't have a whole lot of drippy water everywhere. It's just kind of damp. Now after I have my hill wet, I'm going to choose two colors that I want to mix on this hill. So I think I'm going to start with some, maybe some of this turquoise color. So I have to fill this with some water because watercolors don't work unless you add water to them. And then I'm just going to give it the gentlest little tickle. I'm just going to dip my tip only. And then, using that color, I'm going to spread it onto the hill. Dip my tip, so I'm not putting the silver part of my brush down into the paint. I'm just dipping that very point of the bristles. Dip my tip again, and then spread out the paint. Let's see, I think I just had to dip only 3 times for this hill. So you don't need to be dipping too much. Watercolor is supposed to be very, very light. If your colors are turning out dark, that means you are getting way too much paint. Now I'm ready to mix a second color into it. And I think I'm going to try mixing some purple with my blue. So I'm going to clean off my brush, put a little drop of water into my purple, dip the tip, and I'm not going to put my purple everywhere. I'm just going to kind of tap it on a few places. And when I tap it, the purple paint swirls around and blends with the blue, because we're painting on the wet background. So I'm just tapping purple on a few areas. There we go, maybe a little over here too. Now, while the paint is still wet, we're going to add a little bit of salt to our watercolor. Salt is really interesting when you add it to art projects, paint projects, because it gives your painting a little bit of texture. So I'm getting just the tiniest little pinch of salt, just a few grains, and I'm going to sprinkle it onto a few wet areas of my painting. You don't want it everywhere. If you put salt everywhere, it's going to look like sandpaper. We don't want that. Now you won't really notice a difference right away, but as time goes by and the salt starts to dissolve, you'll see a really cool texture appear. While we're waiting, let's go ahead and paint another hill. This time I'm going to skip up and paint this section. I'm kind of staying away from this hill because I don't want my two wet puddles to mix together. So I'm giving it a little bit of time to dry. So I have to use some water to paint my hill. Not too much. Maybe I'll just do half of it for now. Then I'm going to choose my first color. I'm going to choose yellow this time. Add a little water to it. Dip just the tip. Ooh, if you accidentally get a little too much like I did right there, just spread it out. I don't need to keep dipping more yellow. That was plenty to do the whole area. So I really want to be careful not to get too much. And then I can only use one more color to blend into it. I think I'm going to try this magenta color. Just a tiny, tiny little dip into the paint. I'm going to keep on going until all of my hills are filled in, but be very careful that when you are painting your next hill that you don't accidentally let your two water puddles bump together. I have to keep a little tiny bit of dry paper in between my two hills. If the puddles bump, your hills will become all one big blob. When you're all done, all of your hills and your sky should be filled in with your wet on wet colors. Remember, don't be afraid to leave a little bit of white space in between your hills. This will keep your hills from all mixing together. Also, you might start to see a little bit of texture that was created by the salt.